In this lesson, we'll learn how to set up control curves. So we have this really neat airship that we've built and textured. Now it's time to create a control system for it to eventually bring it to life with animation. So this is really exciting stuff. Getting right into the lesson, if you've ever taken a look at a control rig, you may find that the controls used are made up of curves. And that's for a few reasons. For one, it's very easy to go in and select those objects, and two, by default, curves do not render, making them ideal to use for control systems. Now, when building controls, there are a set of rules or guidelines we want to consider. Now, these aren't set rules, just guidelines, again, that will help make our control rig convenient for animation. So for one, we want to make sure our controls are easy to select, so that we, or the animator, can get right to work with ease. Second, we want to make sure that object is clean, meaning that its transforms are all cleaned up. That way, if we needed to get right back to the default position that the model was built in, we can do so by simply zeroing out our transform parameters. So when we head over to the keying panel later on, we want to make sure that our control object in the end is zeroed out in position and rotation. Now third, we want to make sure that it's very clear to understand what that control controls. So for instance, if we were building a leg control, you may find that that control object is designed to conform around the character's foot, because it's very clear to know that that object is what we'd use to manipulate that character's leg. If you'd like to learn more about building controls, feel free to look into our Introduction to Character Rigging course. But first, we want to understand the basics and get a good foundation. So that's what the purpose of this course is. But enough said, let's say we get right in and build our animation control for this ship. We'll head over to our top view. And what we're going to do is create a triangle. The reason why is because it helps us to clearly see the ship's direction in case, after animation, we were to hide our model and just show our control object, we'd still have a good idea of the orientation of that object simply by looking at the orientation of the control object. All right, with that said, I'll also press the 2 key so we can work under our Animate toolbar, so we can access our rigging and animation tools when it's time for animation. I'll choose Create Curve, Draw Linear. Next, going back to the main control panel, what I'll do is right-click on the Transform menu to collapse it so we can go ahead and turn on Grid Snap. Once it's on, to snap the grid, we could either click on to enable Grid Snap, or if we were to turn off Snap, another way is to hold down the Control key. That temporarily turns on Snap. So with that on, we can now start to, again, create this triangle. You can follow my lead. I'll snap to grid. Once we're finished, we'll right-click and choose Exit Tool. So there's our curve in place. If we were to press the V key to access the Move tool, you'll see where the pivot of this object is, right at the origin of the scene. This isn't too ideal. Instead, what we'd want is for the pivot to be right on top of our curve. That would be better for animation, so that when we move that curve in place, it's a lot better to control the ship from that point. So we have a number of ways of moving an object's pivot. You might have learned of a few ways, but we can manually do that by holding down the Alt key. Before we do that, however, if we were to bring our attention to the Transform menu, and I'll tear it off at the top, if we would like to preserve a pivot after it has been moved, if we want to keep that pivot locked down to be at the new point we define, what we want to do is make sure that Modify Object Pivot is on. You'll find it right underneath Enable Transform Setups. So once that's on, now if we were to hold down the Alt key and start to drag this pivot, that's where that pivot is going to be stored. If we were to hold down Alt again, you'll notice this little arrow right underneath the center of our pivot manipulator. If we were to go ahead and click on that, notice we can lock down this pivot or reset it, which is going to set it back to the original position of this object. However, with the object selected, another way to move the pivot is by using Move Center to Bounding Box. If we were to choose that, notice the pivot is going to pop to the center of this object. Now, if we were to hold down Alt, move the pivot, and then use Move Center to Bounding Box, you may find that the pivot is not going to cooperate, or it's going to stay where we've placed it, simply because that pivot's locked right now. So to bring it back to the object, it's just a matter of holding down Alt, clicking on the arrow, the left mouse button, and choosing Reset. Okay, so we've learned how to move a pivot. Let's go ahead and now center this control object with our ship. Being that the ship is centered on our grid, what we could always do is take the object and place it right at the origin of the grid. So a quick way to do that is to go to our View menu at the top. We'll hide 3D geometry. And what we want to do is look for the bolder lines. Alright, so once we've found that, we can now hold down Control again, and we can now drag this object to the center of our grid. Beautiful. So once it's in place, let's go ahead and go back to our View menu and choose 3D Geometry. Great. Now at this point, we'll head over to our perspective camera. It's very hard to select this object, isn't it? So what we'll need to do is kind of scale it out for selection. So to do that, what I'll do is go to the Display menu at the top and choose Wireframe so we can see our object. I'll press the T key to go to point mode, select all of the points of this triangle, and now pressing the X key for scale, we can start to scale this out. Okay, beautiful. All right, now you may find that the points of the object are a little bit offset. That's no problem at all. Once we have a good scale, we can freely go in and start to move this shape however we'd like it to be on our control rig. So that's no problem at all. And if we would like to snap this back to the center of the ship, well, it's just a matter of dragging the object. It might even be better to do that from the top view. We'll go ahead and drag the object back until it is centered. Beautiful. All right, so at this point, let's go back to our perspective camera and we'll press spacebar to exit point mode. And then we can press the V key and take a look at where the pivot is now. So this is going to be very convenient for animation. Let's say we go ahead and rename this object. We have a number of ways of doing that. We can either hit Enter to go to the object's property page, rename it from the rename field, or another way is via the Explorer. If we were to hit the 8 key, we can go ahead and open up the Explorer. There's our object. We can press F2 to rename it and call it CC for control curve underscore ship 01. All right, wonderful. So at this point, let's go ahead and stop the lesson and finish setting up the animation control for our ship in the next lesson.